Hi, I'm Chris Lorenzo. I'm from a company called Comcast out in Philly, which is that a direction. It's good. It's 70 degrees there and raining, and I'm here, and it's like snowing outside, under 40 degrees. I'm like really cold, and Philly goes from basically wintertime to like really hot 80, 90 degree weather. So there's no good weather there. Philly is nice. Come visit. The Comcast centers are the biggest buildings, internet, dollars, and revenue. But it's kind of funny. I'm here. This is my first LambdaConf, and I'm a web developer. So it's been very interesting coming to some of the talks and being like functional programming. And it's ironic because like as a web developer writing JavaScript for almost 20 years now, functional programming has taken over. They were talking about React and Redux. So a lot of the patterns that you use for functional programming, I've been doing for years, and I just don't necessarily like associate them and say, oh yeah, I'm a functional programmer. I'm just like, I write code, I use map, I use arrow functions all the time, and I'm doing the patterns, and like I've always liked really clean code, and functional programming gives you that. But this talk is more about web development, which will give you some background into my life, and hopefully, it will lead to conversation. And you're welcome to ask me web development questions, WebAssembly questions, all kinds of other how do I build a website type things. And it's kind of interesting how the web has evolved over the years, where it used to be we had websites, and then we got really sophisticated web developers that we started building web apps, and then we had to make these single-page web apps. And then responsive web apps so that you didn't have to always go back to the server to get responses. You could just change stuff on the fly. And now we have this new term called progressive web app, which I will explain later in the talk. So that kind of builds into what we're actually going to get into. But I've built many apps. This is one of them. This is the XFi website, which allows our customers to actually check what's going on their gateway on their internet to see which devices are connected and be able to monitor and turn off your kid's device if they're misbehaving or you want to get their attention or get them to come to dinner. You can just shut off the internet in the house for an hour, get them to come to dinner. And this is a responsive website that we built, so it looks really good on your mobile phone, and it's less than 1 megabyte of code. And I think this will be something interesting for us to talk about is like the size of code, because I don't think we don't take it for granted enough. Like when you have a native app that is way bigger versus JavaScript, a little bit of JavaScript and HTML gets you a whole lot for a very small bundle size. But this talk is really about web versus native. I'm a web developer, and over the years, native has been crushing us. More people use their phones nowadays, and if you're on a phone, you have a native app. And it's the same thing at Comcast. Our XFi site is a website. We build a native app, and as a web developer, I kind of question this. And I'm like, why are we building native apps if we can solve the same problems just through the web? And I had to do some research on this. This is a Googler, Owen, and he has this great article about the trade-offs between web and native. And to summarize this, he says, conventional websites let you reach users, while apps let you deeply engage users. Because one of the things is people are not going to find your app through the App Store. They're going to find you through a search or a search engine. They're going to go to your website, and they're going to see that your app is useful, and then they're going to start using it. Alternatively, if you're a large company like Comcast, and people are buying their internet from you, you could just tell them, if you want to manage your internet, go download our app. This is the same thing like if you buy a washer or dryer or a refrigerator that's hooked up to the internet, they can just tell you, go download your app, because you've already bought something from them. You're obviously going to just go download it. You don't have to find them. And during this time, there was a lot of benefits to native. And our product owners referenced these, and they said, users are trained to download apps through the store. You can monetize through those platforms very easily. They give you a richer user experience. They have the best performance. They can be used offline. You can start up your app. It works. And you can do push notifications. And push notifications really was the biggest reason for creating a native app 5 to 10 years ago. But the downside of these native apps is you bundle everything. It all has to be compiled, and you're sending an 85 megabyte compiled application down to the phone. But then it runs on your phone, but every user is downloading a really large app. And the problem with this can be outlined by Pinterest, who's a great website, and they created one of the first PWAs. And the reason for it is because they were focused on international growth, where not every country has great internet access. And this was years ago. Today, I think a lot of places have very good internet access. But in some third world countries, you have very slow internet access. So if you compare the size of a PWA to an iOS app to an Android app, a PWA might be 150 kilobytes. Super small. And iOS is obviously much bigger than Android because Apple wants you to pay that Apple tax for buying the next size up in storage for an extra $200. It's crazy. Android, they can get apps in 10 megabytes, and they have fast loading. It's pretty impressive. But the biggest issue between the web and native is performance. And here was Pinterest's old website. If you went there on your mobile phone, it took 23 seconds before you could actually use it. So who would want to use an application on their phone that you clicked on it, and you can't do anything with it for 23 seconds? I couldn't imagine opening anything on my phone and waiting that long before I could actually do something with it. And Google has a lot of research about this, the need for mobile speed. And they summarize it with saying that 53% of users abandon a site that takes longer than 3 seconds to load. Performance is a critical thing for the web. The corollary to this is that mobile pages that are 1 second faster experience up to 27% increase in conversion rates. So if you're building a web app or a website and you want your customer to purchase things, the faster you make it, the more money it makes. And the great part is, over time, your phone has gotten way faster than when phones first came out. So we're at like iPhone 15 now. But even over 6 years, the iPhone 8 versus the iPhone 14 is twice as fast as it was back then. So web apps on iPhone 14 are twice as fast, just by the sheer fact that the processors on your phone are twice as fast. Additionally, over the last 5 years, the performance of your web browser has doubled. So Chrome has done a lot of enhancements to how it processes JavaScript, how it processes HTML, that it's gotten a lot better. Another thing is like web development has gotten a lot better thanks to Rust. A lot of our web development tools like Vite is written in Rust. And like I had no idea before, like we used Webpack and then we go into Rust. This is just to go off topic because this is LambdaConf. But Rust has like increased build performance and build time by like 100-fold. To that now, anytime we make a change, it's almost instantaneous on the screen. And that feedback cycle is like why I became a web developer, because I hated compiling things and waiting for things to compile. I like hitting reload and something happens. And I can see changes right away. So again, mobile phones are now twice as fast. The browser's much, much faster. And if you do your JavaScript right, Pinterest rewrote their website. They got interactive in 5.6 seconds. And with newer phones, they're probably interactive in 2 to 3 seconds. Like you could go to a website, download a website, and have an application, a web application running on your phone in a few seconds. Like that's amazing time. But we haven't covered what is a PWA. What is a progressive web app? How is that different from a web app just running on your phone? And this is where we start to get rid of some of the benefits of native. So richer user experience. A lot of people probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference between a web app and a native app if you do it right. Progressive web apps can be used offline. So if you don't have an internet connection, you no longer get that dinosaur running across the screen saying you're offline. And we can do push notifications now. We can send push notifications through a web browser. It's awesome. There's a lot of other things that your web browser can do. We can access your camera. We can do geolocation. We can do Bluetooth. Like we can do all kinds of cool stuff just through your web browser that you no longer need a native app for. But I will warn you, there are 2 types of phones out there. Some are better than others. There are Android phones, and there are Apple phones. I have an Apple phone. I just don't get access to a whole lot of the features that Android has. The Chrome browser has way more access to things on the hardware than Apple allows. But over time, iOS has gotten better with allowing progressive web apps on their phones and allowing more and more access to the hardware. And this is outlined through Maximilio. And he has multiple articles that he releases every year about the progress of PWAs on phones. So there's iOS 12.2, web apps in 2021. And then even some of the Googlers have created applications just to test how many features are available on iOS. And all those things would be green on your Android phone. They're not all green on iOS. But I think they all are green now, today. So this was probably 2 years ago. Actually, that was a few years ago. So today, all of those features now work on your iPhone. And the greatest thing that happened was over a year ago now is that push notifications became available on iOS. And this was the biggest blocker to creating a web app on iOS, was the fact that your product owners wanted to send you messages all the time of, come into our app, or there's a new product available, or you did this thing and we want to alert the user. So now that push notifications are on there, our biggest barrier to actually building web apps for iOS is now gone. And just a quick update. So this was really scary. A few months ago, there was EU regulation to allow or force Apple to allow other browsers on their phone. I think that was it, like other engines. And because of that, Apple was actually getting rid of progressive web apps. They were like, we're not going to have progressive web apps anymore. And then there was a big backlash, and they reversed that decision. So progressive web apps in the EU is still a thing. It will still continue to happen. So you can take everything that I'm about to show you and still use it. All right, so what is a progressive web app? This is my personal website, chiefhacker.com. It is a website. It is static. It has an image of me, and it has some text on it. Any website can be a progressive web app. This is the cool thing about the web, right? Everything is enhanced, and you can add on layers, as many layers as you want. It's kind of funny, like some people are like, we just use HTML, we don't use JavaScript. And I'm like, really? How do you not use JavaScript today? Everything needs JavaScript. So one of the requirements of a progressive web app is your site has to be on SSL, which I think every website is secure or running through SSL. So hopefully that's not a blocker for anybody. The second thing you need is a manifest.json file. It is just a file that sits on your website, and it is a JSON file that has key values for what do you want your name of your app to be, what's your start URL, what pretty colors do you want me to show, and what logos do you want if the user installs it. Take a moment. But don't write this JSON file by hand. Ask ChatGPT to generate for you, or just go to a manifest generator and type in the values, and it will generate the JSON for you. Nobody writes code by hand anymore. At least I don't. I have AI to write everything for me. And as a web developer, all the examples are out there. You don't have to create anything from scratch anymore. The next thing that you need after that is a service worker. Service worker is the best thing that you could introduce to web developers. Everyone knows that caching is really hard. So what they did was you have your HTTP cache layer, and then we created service workers, which is another layer of caching in the browser. What could possibly go wrong with this, right? 2 layers of cache. So service workers exist before you actually go to the network. So the page, every API request that they make, or every fetch request or HTTP request, gets intercepted by this service worker, which is kind of just a function that says, what are you calling? What do you want me to do with it? It has access to the network, and it has access to a separate cache from the browser cache. So you can take all the files that you get through the network and store them in this cache. And if the network goes down or you want to load from that cache, you can. So this is what gives you offline mode. It also gives you some other things that we'll talk about in a little bit. But essentially, a service worker has an install event. During that install, I can say cache.add. I can make fetch requests to get all the files that I need for my website to work offline. I can store them in the cache. And then anytime a fetch request is made, I can respond with the cache or go to the network. Just very simple example for it. So if you have these 3 things, which is a manifest file, you're running on SSL, and you created a service worker which caches things, if you load your website in a mobile phone on Android, or if you load it on a desktop browser, you get an install banner. And that install banner has changed like 3 or 4 times over the last couple years as they try to figure out what's the best way of presenting this to users. But here it is on a mobile phone on Android. You get this cool little banner, install. I mean, feel free to install my personal page. I mean, that's cool. It doesn't really cost me anything. I don't have that many users, so it's cached really well. It's all static. I don't pay an AWS bill or anything. And then you get a cool little icon, the Chief Hacker, and when you click it, it just goes full screen. You don't even have a URL anymore. Kind of looks like a native app. User probably wouldn't be able to tell anymore. And let's see if this video loads. It's automatically playing. But that's how it opens. You click on it, it has a splash screen, it comes up, and you're like in an app at that point. Any questions so far? I'm going to keep going. All right. Now, I'm going to skip the demo until the end because switching between screens is like really difficult and going back into presentation mode. So we'll do more demo at the end, and you can ask questions about PWAs. But I want to go a little bit more into service workers. So service workers, again, are really complicated, but you can do some really cool things with them. So imagine intercepting every network request that happens on your desktop browser. So it allows you to cache files. It also allows you to optimize images. So in the service worker, you can determine, is the user on 3G network? Are they on 4G network? Are they on 5G network? And then based on that, you can send down different images. So if a user's on a slower network, I could send down a lower res image. The cool part is I don't have to change the HTML. So the HTML is still going to request /profile.jpg. And then in the service worker, I can change the URL to be small, medium, or large, depending on the network connection. And if you have a really terrible network connection because you're hiking somewhere in the mountains, like you get gritty. So this is the Philly mascot. This is like my little joke. I know. Yeah. Okay, we got a hockey fan here. I'm not really a hockey fan. I'm a poser, but I know who Gritty is. Everyone in Philly does. And again, the cool part is you no longer get offline mode. So if you actually go in and disable the internet connection, you won't get no internet anymore. What will happen is we can actually detect whether you're online or offline, and we can show, like I gray out my image to show the user that they're offline. So the user can still interact with your site and do things that are cached. If you had like a to-do list, they could even add stuff to do. And then there's a background sync, which I'll talk about in a few seconds, to send stuff back to the server once they're online. It's really important to note that service workers don't operate inside of the DOM environment. You don't have access to HTML or the markup or your normal JavaScript. They operate in a web worker, so they're more like functional programs. They have input and output. They cannot store state, and every time they boot up, they get stuff, and they close down after they're done. So I like to warn people, don't implement service workers until you have your HTTP caching correct first. HTTP caching is how you should really be caching things for the browser. Service workers are more for like doing offline mode. One of the problems is if you don't do them right, you could really screw up your site. And if you try to push updates, like your user won't get the updates because your service worker is caching the previous thing and not getting the new stuff. There are fun tools like Workbox, which will generate a service worker for you from your build. Fun fact, we used Workbox when first setting up our website. And what it does by default is it takes all the files that you deploy to your web server and adds them to your service worker. And we deployed all of our maps to our JavaScript files and all of our unminified JavaScript files. So users were coming to our site and downloading 75 megabytes of JavaScript that they had no need for. So make sure you validate and verify that your stuff is actually doing what it's supposed to do. Anybody have a WordPress blog here? I'm like, nobody uses WordPress. So WordPress makes up like 60 or 70% of the internet still. There are plugins to get your progressive web app going on a WordPress. Just go and click that, install it. And then the cool part is, once you have all this stuff working, you have to make sure that it works. There is pwabuilder.com. You can enter your URL to make sure that your service workers and everything's working. It will check to make sure you don't have this game over, no internet working. There's also tools inside the web browser to test it. Okay, one thing that I hinted at was this notion of background sync. So if you are offline and you create an app and your user obviously wants to continue using it, they made changes, and you want to send something back to the cloud, they have background sync. And this is something that your web worker has a function. It's called sync, or it's an event listener for a sync event. And what that is the browser says, hey, I have internet again. It will wake up your service worker and say, you have internet, do something with it. And at that point, you can then go into your database and send stuff back to the cloud. You could sync back up to the cloud. And that's essentially what background sync is. I have not had a need to use this yet. I'm sure some people who have really advanced web apps will use it. The next thing is push notifications. Has anyone done a push notification before? These things are a pain in the butt. Yeah, even with iOS. So there's really great documentation on how to do push notifications. This is also relevant for iOS or Android. Web.dev And it's 11 pages of reading of when to send push notifications, how to get a user to subscribe, how to do it nicely so that you're not annoying the user and sending them down too many notifications. Because nobody wants notifications for no reason, right? Like, you go to a website and they prompt you, like, can I send you notifications? And you're like, why are you asking this already? I don't even know you yet. So it warns you about that. It gives you all the best practices to do it. And the cool part about web browsers is there's no standards. Like, there are standards, but there's no standards. So if you are on a Windows machine with Chrome, you can send images. You can send an icon image. You can have actions, which are these up-down of what to do to the user after they interact with your notification. That same notification on Windows in Firefox only gives you this little banner down the bottom. I'm like, what the heck? Why are there two different ways of handling this? And then on Mac, you just get this little pop-up notification at the top. You have a little more drop-down, so you can do the different actions. But it's very interesting that there's standards that have pushed the boundaries of what you're supposed to be able to do, and then they work in different ways. The cool part on your phone, on an Android phone, you can actually have a sound wave. It's not a wave, but it's a vibration. So you can do like Star Wars dun, 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 dun. And you can make your phone vibrate to that when they receive a push notification. So it's kind of fun stuff of what you can actually do with progressive web apps. Whew. All right, I'm going pretty fast, but we'll take time during the demo and have lots of questions. So my question is, should I build a PWA or a native app? And 5 years ago, everyone just builds native apps. We've reached this time, though, where we're in 2024, I think is the year, and we have a lot of iOS developers. So I talk to recruiters all the time, and it's like, yeah, we can build an iOS app, no problem. There are lots of developers. You can hire them. They're pretty thrifty, pretty affordable. But Android developers, there's not many Android developers. So if you want a native Android app, you will probably spend more than you will for an iOS app. And so the question is, should we be building native apps, or can we just build web apps? And going back to Owen here, he says it is way harder to get users to try your native app than your website. Again, people are going to find your website, and unless you have a compelling reason for them to use your app, they want to use your website, they can use your website on their phone, why do they need to install your app? So what would I do? If you're building for web anyway, you might as well build a responsive site. You might as well make it really good. Android gives you the best PWA options. So things will work really smoothly on Android. It'll be super fast because, my personal thing is I think Chrome is a little bit faster than Safari on WebKit. So, and then if you need to build a native app, build a native app for iOS. Another reason why you want native iOS developers with Swift is because they have a whole ecosystem of you're building native apps, you're building for iOS or for the tablets, you're building for those things that go on your head now. All of that, they want you to write it in Swift, and you can write it once, and it goes across all those platforms pretty seamlessly. Whereas if you do it for web, it's a little bit more work or integration to do it. The other cool part is there's this thing called bubble wrap. So what bubble wrap is, it's just you could submit your PWA to it, and it actually wraps it in a native app, kind of like Cordova did back in the day. But it basically transforms your website, and it puts a native wrapper around it to launch it in a native app. So here's some examples. This is Twitter, which is now X. So there used to be this site called Twitter. And I actually have both the Twitter native app and the Twitter progressive web app side by side here. I don't know which one's which anymore, but we can see that one, that started up, and then you get that. And there's one of them. And then we'll look at the one next to it. So this is just really demonstrating one's a native app, one's a progressive web app. Your user probably won't know too much of the difference. So the native one here is this one on the left. And I can tell because of the splash screen, you can see how the bird kind of animates up. You could do that on web. You can make it a little bit fancier. And then also, native gives you better integration with your photos on your phone. So you actually got to see the last 3 photos that were available right there, whereas the web doesn't have that integration yet. But it might today. That's the other thing is like the APIs are constantly evolving and changing over time to where we get more features and better integration with the native apps. But again, the performance of the 2 of these are roughly equivalent from the user's perspective. Because, let me go back. When you start up the app, the first thing the app has to do is go request data from the server. And whether you're native or you're web, both of them are loading up and getting the data in probably about the same amount of time, or needed the same amount of time to get the data and process it. There are a lot of really cool progressive web apps. I'm going to demo some after this. But we can do QR code scanning. I think that was one of the coolest things. You can use your camera to actually do QR codes. There's some other cool ones. I'll show you Starbucks in a second. The other thing is, like, Microsoft is fully on board with this, which is, Microsoft. But they actually have a progressive web app store. And you can actually do progressive web apps for desktop, too. So you can make web desktop applications. And you can install them through their store on the Windows machine. So you can go in there and just kind of find a progressive web app in the store. And I expect at some point Android will have this as well, that if you have a really good progressive web app, you could submit it to the Android store, and it will just show up, and users will be like, oh, is it a native app? Is it a web app? It doesn't matter. It runs on your phone, looks and feels the same. There are also really, really good tools. So this is PWA Builder. And here, you can actually go here. This is what you can test your PWA app. You can submit your URL in there, and they will actually bubble wrap it for you. So they will take your website and give you an iOS and an Android build that you can submit to a store. They might even automatically submit it to the store for you, so you don't have to go through that process. And that's like one of the biggest things, the biggest issues with native is like submitting it to iOS and Apple, or Apple and Google. It's like you have to wait a few days for them to approve it so that you can deploy it. With web, like I can push to a website. I mean, we can push to AWS Cloud in under a minute and create a whole web server, and you can send people to it. And here, like, you have to wait a week to get approval to push out a new application, new version. It's like, that's tough. I also really like web development. I can tether to my phone. I can do all the performance specs. Like, the Chrome browser and Chrome environment for web developers is just amazing. It's one of the best development environments for front end. It was kind of funny. I saw the first talk today about inputs and outputs, and I'm like, that's my world. I live at, people are clicking on me for input, and I have to give them something like immediately. And I'm like, man, I wish I was just like a functional programmer where I didn't have to worry about this all the time. But the web is really great. Pinterest, going back to that article, 1 year later, in 6 months, they had 800,000 users using their PWA like their native app. So 800,000 people are just using it. Another thing is, like, the reason for it is, like, if you can have an application on your phone that is only 100 kilobytes, and you're running out of phone storage space, like, imagine if half of the apps that you had on your phone you could replace by one that's 1/100th the size, if not more than that. Like, you're saving so much storage on your phone. All right, so that is it for the slides. Now I'm going to go into demoing some PWAs and open to Q&A. Feel free to ask questions. Hopefully it will be a little bit easier as we go through this. So here is my personal website. I will just show this off. Chrome has really good tools. They have this application. And application gives me how much storage am I now using on the device. I can clear my site data. I can see what is inside of my cache storage. So these are all my files that I'm downloading in that super cache. Go ahead.
Yeah, just moving to the size you mentioned before. And I'm not going to rarely bring people over.
Yeah.
You mentioned that the app will take so much space, but the web app wouldn't do it. If you cache the assets, would that also? It's like worse of the size different.
Yep. Yeah. So like my website, the HTML and the JavaScript is maybe 100 kilobytes, 200 kilobytes. But if I want to store like my image, now I'm talking about a 200 kilobyte image. And I might have some additional files. So it depends on the app and how much stuff they want to store. But you're still probably under a few megabytes in size. I found it kind of weird, like this is taking up 13.5 megabytes of storage. I don't know why. I'm like, because I go into my storage here, and I'm like, okay, I might have a megabyte of entries in here, maybe less. So I'm actually going to have to go through and be like, why are you caching so much? Well, it is caching a whole bunch of the different icons and things, which it doesn't need. So I didn't actually optimize for reducing that size. But yeah, you can definitely, I could definitely use up 100 megs. The cool part is, like, even though my web app might take up 100 megs, the iOS storage, they actually have it like it clears the cache after 30 days. So you might have my service worker and the base files installed, and then the worst thing that happens is when you go to open up that PWA again, it's just going to go to the web and download the assets and then store them for another 30 days. So it's also kind of like self-clearing, whereas native apps, you don't really have that self-clearing ability. Yeah, great question.
So yeah, just real quick about the self-clearing. Wouldn't that be somewhat counterproductive to the idea of being able to have a PWA always be there? Then all of a sudden the user gets this weird experience where they're not, like, say they're not connected online and they want to open up the app and they can't open it because it's been cleared out of the cache.
Yes, that's a great question. So I will summarize this. There's two different experiences. If you're on Android, they don't do the self-clearing. If you're on Apple, they do the self-clearing. So this is another thing of like the different specs from the different browser manufacturers. And they might not do it. They might only do it also when it needs additional storage. So it might not be on 30 days. It could be like you're short on storage. It automatically wipes it out when the user needs to clear it. Like there's no set rules for it. But again, the benefit is the service worker would still be there. You might be able to keep some of your HTML files. I don't know exactly how it would work. You might just get offline. Of inactivity, yeah.
If you access Twitter today, it's 30 days after today. So it's a pretty forgiving cache. The Apple's like
Yeah, so here's another cool thing. Like in my network tools, I can go offline mode. And then, so this is like what my website would do if I had no internet access. And now, hopefully, I can click reload here. I have debugging lines for some reason from many times ago. I am reloading. My network should be completely offline. Oh, so you also have to be careful. You can't disable cache and be offline. Otherwise, you're probably, yeah, I probably just blew up my cache. Let's go back online. This is why I don't demo that changing of images based on throttling, because sometimes it doesn't work. So inside of here, I can set like a fast 3G and a slow 3G. And then inside of your service worker, you actually detect the navigator dot internet connection, some cool property name, whatever it is. And I don't know, there's different settings between what is a 2G connection versus a 3G connection. Like is it 1 megabyte down? Is it 500 millisecond ping time? Like it's all different depending on the browser and everything. So let's see if my internet kind of came back. It is not. Boom, boom, boom. OK, there it is. Yeah, sometimes the Chrome DevTools mess it up. But this is, again, my personal website. It is offline. So this is inside the JavaScript, you can actually listen for offline online events. So this really has nothing to do with the service worker. I'm listening to the event. The browser is offline while I'm here. And now if I reload, let's see if, yeah, so now I'm clicking reload. It's not going to Dinosaur. Inside my application, the other cool part with service workers, I can go here, and I can do bypass for network. So this is now going to bypass my service worker. So it shows that I have a service worker installed and everything. Now it's going to go to the internet, and now I'm just offline. So I don't get my site anymore because the service worker is not responding with my actual files. OK, so on top of this, I also offer a workshop, or I do an all-day workshop teaching people how to build progressive web apps. So this is a dating app for cats that I made. It's called Finge. I don't know if anybody's heard of Hinge before, but yep, it's a great app. So if you have any cats that are interested in meeting other cats in the neighborhood, definitely check out this PWA. Let me reload, see if we can get that little intro video that I have here. Yeah, look at that cat. Oh yeah, he's looking at you. All right. And the goal of this is kind of to teach people about progressive web apps. So finge.lol, you can pull it up on your phone. It's a responsive website. It looks great. And you can install it as a PWA. But the goal of this is also to go through and show you what you can actually do with a web app. So here we got permissions APIs. I can get my current location. So I can type in some stuff. I can get my location. So this is going to prompt me, can this website know my location? So we have all these security protocols in place. And then get location should return Estes Park, Colorado. That is awesome. And that's just using like web IP address location. I can do camera, so I can access my camera. Let's see if stuff works. Hey, it's me. Take a photo. That's great. So now I have a photo. We can do upload of photos. So this is a great way to just upload photos. You can take photos. It's really weird. Like, it's really weird. So this choose files will pick files from your desktop. On a phone, though, you actually have choose files. You can say, you can set the meme type to just like camera, and it will actually just pull up your camera and you can take a photo. So it's much easier, but on a desktop, if you want to access the camera on a desktop, it's like 100 lines of code. You have to do so much additional work. Whereas on a phone, it's different. It's like the web. Some things work the way you want them to, some things don't. We can do recording of audio. So you can do voice recordings and playback. Notifications. I talked about notifications. So notifications are really strange. Well, this is the layers, right? The operating system. There's multiple layers to do notifications. So we first have to enable notifications, allow, and then I can display a notification. Come on, notifications. Maybe I have notifications turned off. Yeah, so permission granted. Finge, you've been catcalled. You can't read it from there, but there's a notification that came up, and it has a little picture of a cat in there, of the cat that catcalled me. So what's interesting, this is not a push notification. So the browser actually has a notification API, which is needed to enable push notifications. Because the service worker will get a push notification, and then you have to use the notification API to actually display the notification. That makes sense, right? You're getting a raw event from a server, and then you need to display it, so you get this other thing. Push notifications, you subscribe to push notifications, so each browser has a unique identity token so I'm using Chrome. I would get a token for my push notification. I would send it to Google Chrome API, push notification server, whatever their API address is, and it would give a unique token so that if my Node.js server wanted to send a push notification, it would have the token, and it would send it to Google's push notification server, which would then alert my browser to say, you got a notification. In my browser, the service worker, there is an event listener for push, and that's what causes a notification to come up. Whew. And then here's my profile. I'm happy. I can view other cats. But this is just an example of a PWA. And again, if the performance of this is really good, users wouldn't be able to tell the difference between a native app and this.
The push notification server, is that a standard API implemented by different browsers? Or is it a Firefox one and a Chrome one?
That's correct. Yeah, so there's a Firefox one, a Safari one, and a Chrome one. The APIs all work the same, but you would register with the Chrome one, or the Firefox one, or the Safari one. So they each work the same way. You would get a push notification. Like I could subscribe to push notifications on Chrome, and then I could open up Safari on my desktop and subscribe to a push notification through Safari. And then I would send one through Safari or Chrome. Like I would have two different push notifications for the same website. If that makes sense.
Two things. One, does that work with bubble wrap? Like, would you get
That's a good question. I don't know. So bubble wrap gives you access to additional hardware features as well. But I don't know how push notifications work because the browser can do it directly. But since you're in bubble wrap, you probably need native push notifications because you're no longer operating inside of the browser. Because what happens on like your Android phone is the browser is receiving the push notification. And once you bubble wrap it, you're inside of a native app wrapper.
follow-up question? If users are like Opera and you have it as part of that, is there a way to keep that coming and users know the browser you have it registered to push notifications?
Say that again, or?
If your user was on a browser that you have not signed up with on their notification service,
Oh.
they tell how many you're visiting?
So you don't actually have to sign up with the push notification service. So I get registered with like Chrome or Firefox or Safari. I didn't have to do anything on my service to actually tell Google or Safari that I want to enable it. You have to create a server key. So whenever I get a registration or whenever I push a notification, I just have to send the same key that they registered with. So there's like a security token key that I get from the browser that I have a public API in the browser. So they're creating a key and sending it to me with my public API. So when I send a push notification to the server, I'm giving them my private key, and they know it's me, and they can send it to that user. I think that's the correct way of how tokens and keys work. Yeah?
So the other question is just, is there an iOS bubble wrap or ability?
I think Bubble Wrap works both for Android and iOS. So it wraps for both platforms. Yeah, because they work the same way. It's just like running and opening up a web browser on the different native platforms. So your website's still a web. It's just inside of a wrapper on the native platforms. OK. So we are almost done. The last one I wanted to show you, this is the most advanced PWA that I've seen, is Starbucks. People drink coffee around here. But I recommend if you go to starbucks.com, add this as a PWA, and just experiment with it. So on my desktop, you actually get this little icon up here that is Install Starbucks. So I can install this app. I'm going to click Install. It's probably a little hard for you to read it. And then now that I've installed it, I now have this like separate little window for Starbucks. And it actually shows up down here as its own little icon on my Task Manager bar. So it's still running inside of a browser, but it looks and feels like an application. And if you play with this, I have this on my mobile phone. So you can go to starbucks.com. On iOS, you actually have to go like add to home screen. So you got to click the little bottom, add to home screen, and then it will install the little icon. And then you launch it from there. It will look like a native app. You won't be able to tell the difference. On Android, you'll get an install banner. So you go there. You might have to go there once or twice before it will prompt you with an install banner. But once you install it, you can launch it. It'll feel just like a native app. And I didn't do the comparison of what the Starbucks app versus this PWA is. But this is a React. I think it's Nuxt website. It's super responsive. Like I said, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between this app and using the native app. So that is all I have. We are 7 minutes early, which is not too bad. Any questions? Anybody wants to know more about web development or Lambda functions? Or I had to I looked up Lambda functions and be like, oh yeah, they're just arrow functions in JavaScript. We use them all the time. Like, thank you for those too.
So just a real quick question now. This is all done in JavaScript. But can you do these PWAs with WebAssembly?
See, everybody always asks about WebAssembly. Yes. So it's hard. WebAssembly has been, it hasn't taken off yet. And one of the problems with WebAssembly is talking back and forth between JavaScript and WebAssembly is still kind of slow. So until the performance of that gets better, there's no benefit of it.
So there's no way to do a purely WebAssembly that has no JavaScript involved in it to do what we have?
Not that I know of yet. I mean, that's like a question for like the Blazor team and stuff of like WebAssembly has come really far, and they've done it so that there's WebAssembly running all the code, and then there's a canvas tag doing your whole UI. Like I played with one site with that, and I was like, it's still pretty slow. So the performance isn't there yet, but eventually you're going to get to the point where you have WebAssembly stuff going down, and then it's like, do you need HTML and CSS anymore? But the downside of WebAssembly is like, I really like the web because any website I go to, I can just go view source, I can see the HTML, I can see the CSS, I can be like, oh yeah, Starbucks is running React with Nuxt because there's code in there, I can see the license files and everything. WebAssembly, you lose all that because it's all compiled down code. There's another question in the back.
Yes. Are there any cross-platform technologies that already build you native iOS and Android apps that will also build you a progressive web app as well?
Yes, there are a couple. There's Flutter, I think, is the new cool kid. React Native is one that has been around. The cool part, or the interesting thing about Flutter, anytime you do cross-platform development, which isn't WebAssembly, you have the people who write iOS and Android code. They're always like, Flutter just doesn't give you the best, or there's always kind of overhead, or Flutter or React Native will get you 90% of the way there. And then that other 10% is like you're dealing with problems that if you didn't have this abstraction, you'd be able to solve easily in the native code. But yes, Flutter is made so that you can actually write for web, you can write for iOS, and you can write for Android. And it will get you all the way there. Yeah, and React Native I think is the same as well. So they have an iOS, Android, and they have React Web as well, which is also interesting because you're writing React and it's exporting to multiple different targets. And the hard part, so I also do like TV app development. The hard part with mobile web and desktop is really like the screen size and the factor, right? You're going from an interface that's the size of your hand to a desktop where you're using keyboard and mouse mostly versus a touch screen. I work with TV devices where you're 10 foot away and you're at 1920 by 1080 and you're using a remote control to interact with the TV. So it's very different interaction. So it's also hard to create one experience that's really good across different platforms. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges. Yep. Yeah, I mean, that you have to ask the Apple developers. There's a lot that goes behind the scenes, right? Which is, if you force everyone to build a native app on iOS, like it's going to give you the best experience. That was one of Apple's big things, is like everything on iOS and Apple TV is native. It runs really fast. It's really performant. They want a really good experience for customers. The other thing is, you know, you have the Apple tax of once you have a native app, if you ask the user for money, Apple gets 30%. And why would they want you to go to the web where you don't get that 30%? Like, they want to keep you on native because then they get money for it. So they've been slow to adopt it, but they're usually slow to adopt web technologies. Google is very fast at like pushing out new things and innovating, and Apple is kind of like a wait and see to make sure people actually want it before they adopt it. But they are at the point where they have push notifications. It's like 3 or 4 years behind where Android had it, but now that it's there, you can start seeing a lot more innovation in progressive web app space. And I think the hard part, you know, for me is like I'm a web developer, but the industry has gone fully to Android and iOS development. They just do native development. And I think it will take a couple more years before they realize like you're spending, you know, 20 or 30% more for an iOS and Android developer than a web developer. If you can get the same experience via web for 20% cheaper, and it's just as good, you know, eventually the economics will be like, will dictate that you should start moving to web again. That's my future prediction. You can comment 2 or 3 years from now, Chris, you were dead wrong. Yeah, it's funny. I have like a video on this, and like one person commented like, you know, why would I use a PWA? Why don't just build it for native? And I'm like, well, there's economies at scale, right? Like there's no Android developers out there, or they're more expensive. And if you build an Android web version, like you're going to have a really good experience. It's going to work really well. Like, why wouldn't you just do that? So that's my 2 cents. Yeah. Awesome.